Glad to see you and glad to be here. The title is, as Dom said, Intriguing Women and Their Friendships in Trollope. It is a truth almost universally acknowledged that Anthony Trollope can empathize at length and thoroughly with utterly transgressive women characters who flout the very taboos and conventional norms which his overt rhetoric and the endings of his novels seem to uphold. What I'll call foundational from the 1980s, feminist studies, and more recent gender, post-colonial, and political studies have shown time and time again that in the clash between a society and an individual selfhood, an authentic identity is understood and gradually realized by the character through acts, words, and their consequences. Trollope compassionates the pain, struggles, and losses his characters experience in their failures to achieve what they desire, their decisions to forego or compromise seriously some dearly cherished goal or way of life. He often also makes explicitly visible a particular group's injustice to individuals who seemingly belong to or stand just outside a community, or to an individual who just cannot cope with the injustice or humiliation, by showing us cracks and consequent losses in society's arrangements. A recurring type in Trollope is the mildly autistic, high functioning, in effect, disabled character. Males we recognize, but the females we tend not to. This theme or characteristic conflict in Trollope between self and society has been studied in such a number of its permutations that it might seem odious to go to it again, even if you've discovered or reconfigured a particularly egregious set of contradictory political social arrangements. Luckily, or maybe not so luckily, it seems women have been losing ground, even constitutional rights in the US, bodily, thematically, and in recent points of view taken by gender studies. So I've chosen women who are openly transgressive, often sexually, at some point in their lives, taking them from across the second half of Trollope's career in very different types of novels. I call my selection Intriguing Women because they merit or repay investigation. What I'll show is a frequently repeated pattern or type of scene, often ignored or not seen as the most important by critics, especially in novels or criticism by men, where Trollope dramatizes the important function of women's friendships in women's lives. First up, The Belton Estate, 1864, a relatively short domestic romance, not that well known, perhaps regarded as dull, sad, and somber, anything but glamorous by those who don't read Trollope regularly. Henry James famously and mischievously, and unfairly because he's unanswerable, said it put him to sleep, and seems to be written for children. I begin with Jane Narden, who evaluates the heroines of the Belton Estate in the context of Trollope's whole oeuvre. The novel is a progressive comedy, a kind of culmination of a group of novels where Trollope subverts the patriarchal ideals of submission and conventional obedience to hierarchies that are obeyed by the chief heroines in his earlier novels. Now, most interpretations of the Belton Estate concentrate on the heterosexual love triangle between the now penniless Clara Amedros, her brother killed himself after with the father, wasting the family's fortune, and her guarded, demanding, gentlemanlike cousin, Captain Frederick Aylmer, and the open-hearted, generous-natured, and farmer-like squire, heir to the Belton Estate, William Belton. To be sure, the novel's plot design enacts an adage Trollope's narrator makes explicit. What is there that any man desires that does not lose half its value when it is found to be easy of access and easy of possession? The fruit that falls easily from the tree, though it is ever the best, is never valued by the gardener. Clara makes the mistake of, and in Trollope's terms, not coying her love. Trollope usually, and even here, praises his women characters for candor and frankness. And more than once, she openly shows Aylmer how much she thinks she values him. This puts him off every time. When, after she has endured an insulting ordeal at Aylmer Park and breaks off the engagement, Alma rushes back to her and begs to resume the engagement. Will, too, the loving Clara, without having to have this extra added thrill of seizing something out of reach, and Halpern's grows more and more aggressive and tenacious when Will learns he has a rival in the field. The book also shows Clara repeating a pattern we see many times across Trollope's novels. She regards herself as shamed if she sees herself and openly admits to switching from an erotic allurement and deluded attraction to one man, here the cold, mean Almer, rather too quickly to a much more active desire and genuine respect and congeniality with another, here the nearly uncontrollable, passionate Belton. I suggest the lessons we are served up become more than variations on how to cope with an absurd problem, how to say yes and not say yes at the same time. The inner worlds of Belton and Clara, as depicted by Trollope, especially in the first proposal scene, are shaped by genuine insights into two specific, well meaning, young or naive people. And there's a serious issue here. Clara has not divested herself of her society's norms, and these it is that threaten her. She might make a choice that would lead to misery for life for her. I find subversive and therefore questioning of patriarchal norms and unusual in Trollope's oeuvre Clara Amedroz' relationship with her book-long friend, Mrs. Mary Askerton. Nauden sees Clara and Mrs. Askerton as set up by Trollope to be parallel characters. He does this in other novels. For example, Carrie Brattle, a castaway in the Vicar of Bullhampton, with Mary Lowther, like Clara, genteel but broke. Nauden argues the novel demonstrates how destructive and dangerous for women are the supposedly moral conventional norms they are taught will keep them safe. I suggest, though, in this case, the transgressive woman, Mrs. Askerton, is not primarily in the novel to function as a parallel to Clara, the apparently virtuous one. Mary Askerton is there to show us a defiant and loyal friendship between these women, a defiance important in the book's plot design. When Aylmer's mother realizes how poverty-stricken Clara is, she looks to break up her son's engagement in any way she can. Discovering the rumors about Mrs. Askerton's previous life, that she left an abusive husband and lived with Colonel Askerton before her first husband died, Lady Aylmer demands that Clara promise she will have nothing to do with this woman who had been her friend. This will be an act by which Clara demonstrates how she appreciates Aylmer's sacrifice in marrying her, and will in future obey what the Aylmer family thinks is his and its interests. Now, it's true that Mrs. Askerton's thinking about men and women, even now, many years later, is the familiar sexualized talk, often used to justify domineering or hegemonic masculinity. In the usual softened form it comes. The notion that a woman wants a man hard to get, aloof, rich, high rank, who will dominate and thus thrill them. It seems to have been notions such as these, as Trollope's narrator presents these scenes, that attracted Clara when she said yes to Aylmer. But gradually, and after Clara and Mrs. Askerton have had experience of Will's decency towards them and the ugly way the Aylmer family treats Clara, Mrs. A encourages Clara to accept the man who does not conform to these norms. Will is clumsy, awkward, not elegantly handsome, not au courant with upper class culture, and he's openly eager to be friends. Mrs. Askerton's experience of her husband's behavior to her, thoughtful, kind, and good, he's the sort of person who stays home with her reading novels, is as important in the story as these delusions. Will is thus another generous man for us to look at. Trollope also makes Clara's friendship with Mrs. Askerton central to the book because this allows him to dramatize the loneliness and isolation of Mrs. Askerton's life, how she remains an untouchable in her society and can scarcely live a life except one of reading and domesticity with her husband, who can get to go out among people. Clara was a rare person to visit and to befriend Mrs. Askerton. Mrs. Askerton is suspected of having done something wrong, of being unacceptable because she refuses to socialize. Anticipating the abject, socially frightened, and self-stigmatizing behavior of Mrs. Peacock, who is perhaps guilty of bigamy in Dr. Wardle's school. Mrs. Askerton's gratitude to Clara prompts her to offer Clara the Askerton cottage to stay when Lady Aylmer has made the Aylmer's estate impossible for her unless Clara is prepared to ostracize and insult Mrs. Askerton. Trollope shows us the conversations between the two friends. Chapter 18, Mrs. Askerton's story, which tells us of Mrs. Askerton's past and memories, to be supportive of Clara in ways we never see in, say, Lady Glencora's conversations with Alice Vavasor, or other of Trollope's heroines with an older female authority, say a mother or aunt. Mrs. Askerton, through irony, defends non-conventional choices. Trollope, astonishingly, is leading us to approve of Clara's defiance of Lady Aylmer and critique the world's exclusion of Mrs. Askerton. In this novel, human bonds between women. Clara is also befriended by Will's crippled sister, Mary Belton, are presented as more important in securing the happiness and safety of a woman than marrying high rank and money. The second long chapter devoted to Clara and Mrs. Askerton's relationship, 21, Mrs. Askerton's Generosity, concludes on a crucial letter written by Mrs. Askerton to Clara, rather like an 18th century epistolary novel, where characters write letters to one another while they live in the same house and are in different rooms. So here, as throughout the novel, Mrs. Askerton's conversation shows her to be generous-hearted to her friend, exposes cant, is anything but the witch-like and abject caricatures of fallen women we find Trollope occasionally alludes to and himself depicts in the case of sexually transgressive women. Again, Carrie Brattle is my example, the castaway of the Vicar of Bullhampton. She is to me a sight of cringe-worthy abjection. Mrs. Askerton prompts Clara to think candidly to herself about what she really feels. What is it she really wants? I can quote only a tiny part of a dialogue surrounding and Clara's response to this letter. Clara's first impulse on receiving this letter was to go off at once to the cottage and insist on her privilege of choosing her own friends. If she preferred Mrs. Askerton to Captain Aylmer, that was no one's business but her own, and she would have done so had she not been afraid of meeting Colonel Askerton. As she thought of all this, she asked herself various questions concerning him, which she did not find it easy to answer. Did she wish to be Aylmer's wife? Could she assure herself that if they were married, they would make each other happy? Did she love Aylmer? This epistolarity, inwardness, and frank dialogue in the Belton estate will enable us to segue into The Way We Live Now, a late book, massive, with global reach, regarded by many as one of Trollope's masterpieces and one of his signature texts, given unforgettable realization and popularity by Andrew Davies' 2001 serial adaptation. I again want to show a different set of patterns than people usually emphasize when they talk of this book. Trollope unfolds this story through a series of character portraits where the women are linked to one another and brought into the book through their relationships with men. Strikingly, as all remember who have read The Way We Live Now, the novel opens by introducing us to Matilda Lady Carberry by means of 3 manipulative letters she has written to 3 male editors of influential newspapers in order to pressure them to write favorable reviews of her book, Criminal Queens, which caricature title Trollope uses to suggest Lady Carberry's work is titillating trash. Marie and her stepmother, Mary Melmotte, emerge as part of the material that links Sir Felix Carberry to Augustus Melmotte. As a solution to Sir Felix's problem, he is bankrupt. Georgiana Longstaff emerges in a chapter linked to the story via her father's problem with money for keeping up his estates. And looking to Melmotte for help, Dolly Longstaff's Bear-Groton connection to Felix also brings Georgiana into the book. We meet Ruby Ruggles as the country girl Sir Felix is exploiting sexually, so to speak, on the side. When forced to visit Carberry Manor with his mother, Mrs. Hurdle first appears as an incident in Paul Montague's life, someone he cannot break off from since she's brought herself, beautiful, intelligent, gifted, and in love with him, to London. In my analysis, The Way We Live Now will remain, as Trollope refers to it in all his notes, a Carberry novel, with Lady Carberry as her connections, which include Roger and his unofficially adopted son, Paul Montague, as central characters. Her literary world, as described by Trollope, is as corrupted by money as Melmotte's. I don't say we shouldn't study these women characters with the males who are important to them, Mrs. Hurdle with Paul Montague especially, Lady Carberry with Mr. Brown, as well as her son Felix, Marie with her father, Felix and Lord Liddell, and Georgiana's correspondence with Mr. Brighart, or downplay Melmotte, especially in the latter parts of the books, where he's overreached himself through a gargantuan dinner and election, where he's called hostile attention to. Rather that, I suggest, to grasp the valence, the intrinsic full tone of the novel, and the functions of its women, is to look at the scenes of their relationships with one another. So the interior views Trollope gives us of them deciding what to do next, what to plan on their own, and with one another, and again, look at their letters. Time will permit us to go into only the climactic scenes of caring and supportive friendship or behavior between Marie Melmotte and Hedda Carberry and Winifred Hurdle. Of the many semi and wholly antagonistic, abrasive, self-protective scenes between women who've had a relationship to one another, as, for example, the interwoven scenes between the resentful and callous Lady Carberry and her daughter, Hedda Carberry. There are numerous long and short scenes between them throughout the book. The tussle-like threats of Mrs. Hurtle and Mrs. Pipkin hurl at Ruby Ruggles. We will just look at those antagonistic frenemies, Georgiana Longstock and Juliet Lady Monogram. To me, tellingly, once you start to look at the book in this way, at these relationships, through these kinds of scenes and interior views, you realize how frequently Hedda Carberry occurs and how she is central to the book, how courageous and individually motivated Hedda Carberry can be, though she's often talked about in a dismissive way as dull, conventional, and one note, which just goes to show nobody's paying attention to her. Not for real. The scenes where Hedda Carberry visits Marie Melmoth, and later Mrs. Hurtle, provide Marie and Hedda with more than needed information to resolve an important decision in their lives. Hedda and Mrs. Hurtle respectively show Marie and Hedda a condition of mind that demonstrates to Marie and Hedda the nature of the particular male who is involved, his past actions in such a way that Marie and Hedda can draw upon an emotional terrain communicated between the two women that escapes the literal, pragmatic, and normative criteria their society says they must act by. Impulses and understandings associated with feminine and intangible psychology, intuitive and empathetic, not goal-oriented, are what they rely on and turn the scenes in directions they take. Important, too, are the personal, subjectively difficult events and feelings that occur to the women just before their conversations with one another. I'll begin with Hedda and Winifred, if I may use her name, because the scene is complicated by inward interaction, goes on at length. As many have said, Winifred Hurtle is the most complicated and, from the point of view of individual characteristics in a novel, the most interesting major character. Hedda arrives after a final touching scene between Paul and herself. Hedda has been racked by Lady Carberry as her brutal mother, tried, tormented, afflicted in ways parallel to the physical abuse Melmoth has just heaped on Marie, received an indignant, reproachful letter from Paul, and decided she does in fact want to spend her life with him. The final point of his letter is to ask if she can give this up, no matter what he has done. We've heard some poignant talk between Mrs. Hurtle and Mrs. Pipkin, who is very sorry the engagement is over because her tenant will be returning to America. And we've listened to Winifred decide to give up Paul Montague and tell herself she can do no good to herself by telling her wrongs to anyone, much less another woman. Defying her mother and an anticipated harrowing sexual mortification, Hedda goes to Mrs. Hurtle's lodgings. Mrs. Hurtle does not deny her recent encounters with Paul, including whatever occurred at Lowestoft. In the book, this is left ambiguous, but she says that Paul emotionally stopped loving her well before Lowestoft. He came as a loving friend, so she would not be alone. She says that she was true of heart and has been broken in spirit by what has happened, but she has forgiven all his treachery and is now not strong enough to punish the one I still love. In effect, Winifred presents a picture of Paul's nature as a loyal, kindly, sincere man, and herself as a wronged woman, without further specifying why Paul has chosen Hedda, than that Paul has preferred a virginal girl to an experienced woman. What she conveys reaches some profound place in Hedda, and Hedda begins to cry, and leaves with a determination to reconcile herself to Paul. Nothing her waiting mother, whose spiteful response to Hedda's "she is a wonderful woman" is "and she has told you wonderful lies" can now deter her. Less verbal information passes between Hedda and Marie in the earlier climactic scene. Marie does most of the talking. Hedda sticks to variations on the same words her brother told her to say. "It must all be over, Miss Melmoth." This scene occurs after the harrowing and mortifying humiliation Marie has endured when Felix spends all the money she has given him on drink and gambling, never even trying to get to the train to Liverpool. She has been arrested, separated from Didon, who fled with her jewels, and is living not in Grosvenor Square, for there is no money for this after the extravaganza of the Emperor's dinner, but in the Longstaff house in Bruton Street. This time Hedda confronts Melmoth himself, persuades him to take her to his daughter, though she's identified herself as Sir Felix's sister, and agrees to walk with him. This time the conversation consists of short declarative sentences in vociferous give-and-take style, highly exciting field with Marie's exasperation, shouted laments coming out of her loneliness, despair no one has or ever will love her. We have been told that Marie's mother died when Marie was very young, an abused woman who may have ended living on the streets. And as the conversation continues, Marie's increasingly bitter anger. Hedda has been self-controlled, revealed nothing of herself, and wished she had not come, but conveyed accurately what kind of a human being her brother Sir Felix really is. Here is just one passage. Hedda, men are not, I think, like girls. I suppose not, said Marie slowly. What liars they are, what brutes, what wretches. Why should he break my heart? That other man, Nidderdale, never said he loved me. If you loved a man and told him of it and agreed to be his wife and done as I have, could you bear to be told to think of him no more, just as though he had got rid of a servant or a horse? I won't love him, no, I'll hate him. Marie has been directed into beginning to build a carapace around herself. It's by focusing on women's friendships in this novel, we can understand the importance of Julia, Lady Monogram's refusal to maintain even a slightly friendly, barely supportive relationship with Georgiana when Georgiana is staying with the Melmots. Georgiana finds she can meet only those people who visit the Melmots and whom they visit. And she finds them as unacceptable as her friend. Georgiana is as obdurate as Julia, incapable of throwing off any of the social codes of her group, including ethnic and racial prejudice, in this case against Jews, all of which are presented by Lady Monogram as her excuse for dropping Georgiana because they are crucial criteria for status and self-protection. Although seemingly such a small part of the book, Georgiana's encounters with Julia are memorable, because in them we see operative, inexorable, socially derived patterns of exclusion that Georgiana and Julia agree are crucial to a young woman's fate. Georgiana shows no sense in these that she needs to make a biological or sexual connection with a man, which is what Mr. Brinkhurst is offering, since he specifically includes stepmotherhood. Georgiana's mother is to her only a conduit to reach her father. It's not irrelevant to compare Mrs. Hurdle's apparent caring for Mrs. Pipkin's children. Mrs. Hurdle goes beyond presents to take them to the seashore. Georgiana never understands why she loses all social leverage, which is why she must run away with the curate to maintain any respect from others, and at the same time a distance from them in order not to hear their scorn. She has not been willing to give anything of herself and thus has made no friends. I'm one of those who denies a common view that the way we live now is a starkly and exaggerated, dark, bitter book. At least a fair assessment leads me to assert that Trollope seems less alienated from its characters and content than say he is in The Claverings, a medium-length novel, 1864, with central allusions to caustic and amoral 18th century plays, or Kept in the Dark, a late fierce novella against women's sexual liberty, a kind of he knew he was right without the six tonic stories. The wonders of the last book I've chosen to discuss, mellow and often beautiful in its picturesqueness, The Unabridged Duke's Children, for the sake of its tragic heroine, Lady Mabel Grex, and her faithful unmarried companion, Miss Cassowary, includes the reality there is no consensus about it as yet. Written 1876, serialized in an abbreviated form 1879, first and finally published whole in 2015. I also chose to take my women from the Duke's Children, as it is one of the 12 famous, most popular of Trollope's novels, the Barsetshire and Palliser books. In my view, in its present form, it's a culmination, a crowning book to the Pallisers, in the way the last chronicle is to the Barset books. Now, hitherto, admired studies of the Duke's Children, we must call it abridged, have focused on the Duke himself, as a grieving and hurt widower, an unprepared and socially disabled father, on the maturation of Lord Silverbridge, signaled by his choice of a sexually innocent American heiress over the disillusioned, sexually knowing Lady Mabel Grex, and Silverbridge's realization he cannot separate himself from his family politics because no one will allow this. In this perspective, the other primary couple of the book are Silverbridge's sister, the Duke's daughter, Lady Mary Palliser, and Silverbridge's friend, Frank Tregear. It was Frank Tregear's intelligent and conservative rhetoric that lured Silverbridge into attempting a rebellion against his father in the form of a conservative political identity, i.e., be a Tory, with Lady Mary's role being that of the personally unambitious, aristocratic young woman. He and Lady Mary become surrogates in the Duke's mind for the now dead Lady Glencora and Burgo Fitzgerald. But more than 21 years ago, the Duke recalls painful moments of Lady Glen showing herself coerced into marrying him, whom she hardly knew beyond a felt incompatibility of temperament and instinct. The family aim was to provide him with an immense fortune and to saddle her with a controlling, prudent husband. He is correct to think Lady Glen herself identified Mary's romance with her own long ago. In most of these readings, Lady Mary becomes a surrogate for what would have happened to young Lady Glencora had Lady Glencora refused to marry a man she didn't love. Lady Mabel's significance is as a reinforcement or contrast to some aspect of the other stories. For example, by not marrying her, Lord Silverbridge avoids repeating his parents' frustrations. In feminist readings across Trollope's oeuvre, she is just such another Mrs. Hurdle, who cannot give up her previous beloved, so may end up living alone. But I would note she is not berated and egregiously punished, like other openly transgressive heroines who Trollope seems at times to sympathize. Julia Lady Ongar, the Claverings, who may have committed adultery during the worst days of her high-pressure marriage, or Mrs. Euphemia Smith, John Caldergate, who after a very favorable entrance ends up the worst treated of any of Trollope's heroines, imprisoned while her possibly bigamous husband in the end is freed and rewarded. Having read the abridged and unabridged Duke's Children last summer, back to back, it seems to me the put-back material shows us there was intended a third, not so ghostly couple, who would function significantly in their own right, Lady Mabel Grex and Frank Tregear, whose past story haunts the book as surely as that of Lady Glencora. Across the book, starting with the often-quoted Chapter 7 in Medias Res, where Trollope's famous outburst against novels which start in Medias Res seems to me both to call attention to and cover up the hidden stories of Lady Mabel and Frank, which started where there is no text and carry on existing with nothing but memories referred to. The scenes bring us right back to Trollope's fundamental theme of an authentic self in conflict with the circumstances and demands of his or her environment and other people. Lady Mabel's history is of a girl orphaned young, living with a vicious brother and callous father, falling deeply in love with an intelligent young man, and then wresting herself away because she adheres to the hierarchical patriarchal values of her society and does not believe she could endure a lower status, a money-straitened condition. It's important to recognize Frank and Lady Mabel were lovers. That's partly why she holds it against him that he could forget, that he could find a woman to provide him with a fortune rather quickly, and act on his own otherwise in seeking a career. It also explains why he reiterates that he begged her to take him, that he would have married her, and that they could have made it. He remains bitter at her for having rejected him. Well played by Jeremy Irons in the 1975 episodes of Bravens the Pallises. The immediate question is why cannot Lady Mabel get herself to take advantage of Silverbridge? For the narrator suggests after her initial sparing of Silverbridge, there were 3 more opportunities across the novel for her to soften and say yes. And yet she jeers at and triumphs over him. She's wry and sarcastic over all the social activities going on around her. In the scenes in Scotland, she keeps it quiet. I suspect that John Butt, in his study of ambivalence in the abridged Duke's Children, is accurate to say that in the recesses of her heart, Lady Mabel wanted neither man, and still does not. The scenes at the end of the novel, where she begs Silverbridge to ask her to marry him, Frank to let her become his mistress, are so harrowing and mortifying because she's acting against an inner grain of her being. She takes as her one friend her sympathizing and impoverished, never married female cousin, Miss Cassewary, and to close the book, she retires with her on a very small income, seemingly as someone haunted. Let us listen to what Lady Mabel says to Miss Cassewary early in the book. She has been berated by her father as forcing him into the expense of a house in Belgrave Square. She has offered, in contrast to Mary Melmotte, to sign away all her rights to him. She has gone through the work of dining out with him in an atmosphere of gaiety, where she finds she gives away to Dolly Longstaff, of all people, her real concern over Frank Tregear's dissolute behavior. As here we learn in an unexaggerated way how much she cares for Frank. Returning home, she finds Miss Cassewary alone, very relieved she didn't have to go to Mrs. Montague Jones's ball, and they have a heart-to-heart talk. Who am I, said Miss Cassewary, about the dearest friend a poor girl ever had. Lady Mabel comes closest to the Duke in criticizing and worrying about Frank's gambling, because it's also a mean way of triumphing and acquiring money. She tells Miss Cassewary of how and why she's let Silverbridge escape a trap he had set for himself, asking, "Shall I go to heaven for doing that?" At which Miss Cassewary reassures her he will come again. Lady Mabel says she's not so sure, and then tellingly associates both Tregear and Silverbridge with other eligible suitors, so odious to me, I'm quoting her, with whom I could not bear to be linked for life, as to whom the idea of marriage seems to be mixed up somehow with an idea of suicide. End quote. The depth of the interchange reminds me of Mrs. Peacock talking to the somewhat bewildered but very good Mrs. Wordle in Dr. Wordle's school, or Mary Lady Mason to Mrs. Penelope Orme in Orley Farm, where the crime has been forgery, perjury, and Lady Mason has held on to the property. Miss Cassewary is shocked, but we come across this idea of marriage as a form of death in other of Trollope's women. I suggest Lady Mabel resembles Mary Lady Mason in having masked herself for so long rather than face her alienation. She makes a strong contrast, that is Lady Mabel, to another woman character who does not belong to the female types I've talked thus far about here. Someone who has known how to keep her transgressions well out of view, Madame Max Goesler, whose behavior in social situations is only partly a mask. In a talk I delivered at a Trollope conference in Exeter, I argued that Trollope's novels are comfort romances for heterosexual men, where he empathizes deeply with men who have contradictory and difficult demands made on them. Here I have found the best way for a contemporary person like myself to reach what Trollope has to say about women usefully and morally is to look for particular patterns of fiction and voiced attitudes of voiced attitudes of mind found most frequently in women's novels, and to delve what he's made of these. He does include mother-daughter scenes throughout the books, but I've chosen to dwell on women's friendships, a book topic if you take in the many other kinds of heroines I've not had room for. For example, these are other friendships and frenemies. Lady Glencora and Madame Max, across the parliamentary novels. Nina Balatka and the woman who saves her from killing herself, Rebecca Loth, and Nina Balatka. Predatory relationships. Julia Lady Ongar and Sophie Gordeloup, the Claverings. More minor pairs, especially sisters. Say the letters between Dorothy and Trollope's one openly lesbian character. The character he said was the heroine if he knew he was right, Priscilla Stanbury. Dr. Thorne yields quite a crew of not so supportive and yet treacherous friendships. And last of all, the temporary partnerships in the novels. Once again, Madame Max, this time with Amelius's landlady, Mrs. Meeker. That's Phineas Redux. If we looked at these women's patterns, I suggest we would end up paying attention to very different kinds of turning points and learn differently about women's experiences in Trollope's novels, especially from his women characters' voice points of view when with other women. His books might open to us in a new or different way than they hitherto have. Okay, that's it.